The klaxon had been screaming for 3 minutes when Marcus Cole finally understood he was going to die in this hallway. Smoke curled through the shattered crystal columns of the Azure diplomatic complex, mixing with the acrid stench of plasma burns and something else, something copper and warm that he recognized from battlefields 30 years gone. His left shoulder throbbed where the blade had caught him, blood soaking through the makeshift bandage he'd torn from his uniform jacket. 68 years old, and here he was playing soldier one last time. 12 Azure warriors formed a crescent before him, their armor gleaming with that impossible blue luminescence their species seemed to carry in their very bones. Each one stood 7 feet tall, bred for war, enhanced by technology humanity couldn't begin to understand. Behind Marcus, the reinforced door to the safe room hummed with energy, the only barrier between these killers and the two people he'd somehow become responsible for protecting. The tallest warrior stepped forward, and Marcus felt his gut clench with recognition. Prince Kale, nephew to the Empress herself, moved like water, given form and purpose. His blade cast long shadows across the ruined floor, painting everything in shades of violence. Old man, Kale's voice carried that peculiar resonance Marno and Azure possessed, like hearing someone speak from inside a cathedral. You think yourself a hero. Marcus shifted his weight to his good leg, the K-bar knife in his hand, feeling impossibly small against the alien technology arrayed against him. The weapon had been his father's in Korea, then his through 3 tours through Desert Storm, through everything that mattered. Now it would be the last thing he ever held. I'm no hero. The words scraped against his throat, rough with smoke and exhaustion. Just a man who doesn't know when to quit. Kale laughed, the sound echoing off the crystalline walls. Then let me teach you. The prince lunged. 72 hours earlier, Marcus Cole had been nobody. The night shift at the Azure Diplomatic Complex paid $18 an hour, which was $3 more than the trucking company had offered, and didn't require him to spend 14 hours behind the wheel of a semi. At 68, with 2 metal pins in his knee and a shoulder that ached when storms rolled across the Gulf, Marcus had learned to value the simple dignity of standing upright. Houston sprawled beyond the complex's crystal spires, a maze of refinery lights and suburban sprawl that had been home for the past 5 years. Before that, there'd been Virginia in the house he'd shared with Helen for 32 years. But Virginia held too many ghosts now. Their bedroom where she'd taken her last breath. The backyard where Ryan had learned to throw a football. The porch where 2 Marines in dress blues had stood with their hats in their hands, telling him his son wasn't coming home from Kandahar. Texas asked nothing of him. Texas let him disappear. The complex itself was technically sovereign Azure territory, a quarter-mile of impossible architecture rising from the Texas flatlands like a fever dream. Humanity had been in contact with the Azure Imperium for 15 years now, ever since their scout ship had decloaked over the United Nations building and politely requested an audience. The trade agreements that followed had transformed human technology, medicine, energy production. In exchange, the Azure wanted something far simpler, a foothold on Earth, a place to study the curious little species that had somehow crawled from the primordial muck and split the atom before learning not to hate each other. Marcus walked the perimeter 3 times each night, checking locks that couldn't be picked with human tools, monitoring cameras that saw in spectrums he couldn't pronounce, logging observations in a tablet that translated his rough Texas drawl into 17 different languages. The Azure staffers ignored him entirely, flowing past in their robes of woven light, their conversations pitched at frequencies that buzzed against his eardrums like distant bees. To them, he was furniture, background noise. He'd made peace with that particular invisibility years ago. Human. The voice caught him mid-stride, and Marcus turned to find one of the junior diplomats watching him with those luminescent eyes. Kavera, he thought her name, was one of the lower-tier attachés who handled mundane matters like atmospheric conversion and gravity calibration. Ma'am, you have been walking the same route for 723 nights. Kavera's head tilted at that alien angle they all affected, like birds studying something that might be food. Your patterns never deviate. Your reports are precise to the minute. Why? The question caught him off guard. In almost 2 years, no Azure had spoken directly to him about anything other than access codes and schedule changes. Discipline, he heard himself say. Old habit from the service. Service, Kavera tested the word like an unfamiliar spice. You were a soldier. Marine, long time ago. Our records indicate you served in what your people call the Gulf War. Operation Desert Storm. Her eyes brightened slightly, that telltale sign of azure curiosity. You were decorated for valor. Saved members of your unit under fire. Marcus felt the old weight settle across his shoulders, the one he'd carried since 1991. 6 men had gone into that forward position. He'd dragged 4 of them out one at a time through 300 meters of burning sand. While Iraqi mortars turned the world into thunder and screaming, 2 men had stayed behind. He still saw their faces every time he closed his eyes. That was another life. Kavera studied him for a long moment, then made that subtle gesture Azure used to indicate acknowledgement. You are more than you appear human. I wonder if the others see it. She walked away before he could respond, disappearing into the labyrinthine corridors that shifted and changed according to algorithms Marcus had never bothered trying to understand. He stood there for a moment longer, unsettled in ways he couldn't name before continuing his patrol. The complex felt different tonight. Marcus had learned to trust his instincts in places like this, the same instincts that had warned him about the ambush in Kuwait, that had screamed at him to move 3 seconds before the IED exploded in Fallujah during his advisory tour. The Azure liked to pretend humans were simple creatures governed by obvious emotions and predictable responses, but they'd never served in a combat zone. They didn't understand how violence taught you to read the air itself. Something was coming. He could feel it in his bones. The Empress arrived at dawn. Marcus had never seen an Azure procession before, and the sight of it stopped him mid-breath. 200 figures in ceremonial armor flowed through the complex main atrium, their movements synchronized with mathematical precision. At their center, borne on a platform of solidified light, sat a throne carved from what looked like frozen starlight. Empress Valeria of the Azure Imperium carried 4.5 centuries in her bearing. Her skin held that same deep blue tone as her people, but there were lines around her eyes, a certain weight in the set of her shoulders that spoke of ages rather than decades. Her hair fell in waves of pure silver, so bright it seemed to glow with its own inner light. She wore robes of midnight blue worked through with threads of gold, and her eyes, when they swept across the assembled crowd, held the cold patience of someone who had outlived everyone she'd ever loved. Marcus pressed himself against the wall as the procession passed, just another piece of human furniture in an alien space. But for one instant, those ancient eyes found his, and something flickered there, something that might have been recognition or curiosity, or simply the automatic cataloging of a potential threat. Then she was gone, swept up in the pomp and circumstance of imperial arrival, and Marcus was left with a strange tightness in his chest he couldn't explain. The diplomatic reception that evening was nothing short of spectacular. Marcus had drawn security duty for the peripheral corridors, far from the glittering assemblage of Azure nobles and human dignitaries, but close enough to catch glimpses of the proceedings through the crystalline walls. The complex's architecture turned sound into visual displays, conversations blooming into fractals of colored light that danced across every surface. He was 3 hours into his shift when he noticed the pattern. Security work taught you to watch for anomalies, the details that didn't fit the expected framework. Marcus had spent 2 years learning the rhythms of the Azure complex, the way certain staffers moved at certain times, the subtle hierarchies that governed every interaction. Tonight something was off. A group of warriors, 6 in total, had been cycling through the secondary corridors with unusual frequency. Their armor bore the markings of the Imperial Guard, but their movements lacked the ceremonial precision Marcus had observed in the Empress's procession. These were combat patterns, the kind of careful positioning that preceded an assault. His hand drifted to the radio at his belt, then stopped. Who would he call? The Azure security chief, Lord Varen, had made it abundantly clear that human concerns were irrelevant in matters of Imperial safety. The other human guards were stationed half a complex away, and by the time he explained the situation, whatever was going to happen would already be over. Marcus Cole was 68 years old. His knee predicted storms, and he hadn't fired a weapon in anger since 2004. The smart play was to document what he saw, file a report, and let the Azure handle their own problems. Instead, he followed the warriors. The complex layout shifted constantly, corridors rearranging themselves according to some architectural logic Marcus had never grasped, but 2 years of night patrols had taught him the patterns. He knew which routes stayed stable, which junctions led, where which maintenance passages the Azure never bothered to monitor. Moving through the shadows like he had through the streets of Basra 30 years ago, he tracked the warriors to a restricted section near the Empress's temporary quarters. They were planting something. The devices were small, no larger than Marcus's fist, but they pulsed with the same blue energy that powered Azure weapons. He'd seen enough explosives in his lifetime to recognize the configuration-shaped charges positioned to direct their blast inward, toward the royal chambers. His body moved before his mind caught up with the implications. 30 years of training overrode 68 years of caution, and suddenly he was flowing through the darkness like water through cracks in stone, like the ghost his unit had called him back in the desert. The first warrior never saw him coming. Marcus caught him from behind, one arm across the throat, cutting off blood flow to the brain, with a chokehold he'd learned before these aliens knew Earth existed. The body went limp in 8 seconds, and Marcus lowered it silently to the floor. The second warrior was faster, spinning at some subtle sound, hand reaching for the blade at his hip. Marcus closed the distance before the weapon cleared its sheath, driving his knee into the alien's midsection with enough force to double him over, then bringing both hands down on the back of his neck. The warrior crumpled. The third one got his blade free. Blue light carved through the air, missing Marcus by inches as he threw himself sideways. He hit the floor rolling, came up with the K-bar in his hand, and met the warrior's next strike with a deflection that sent sparks showering across the corridor. The alien was faster, stronger, better equipped, but he fought with the arrogance of someone who had never faced a desperate opponent. Marcus had been desperate since 1991. He let the next strike graze his forearm, accepting the pain as the price of getting inside the warrior's guard. The Kabar found the gap in the armor at the armpit, sliding home with a resistance that told him he'd hit something vital. The warrior made a sound like breaking glass and collapsed. 3 down, 3 more still out there, probably alerted by the commotion. Marcus didn't wait for them to find him. He gathered the planted devices, his hands steady despite the blood running down his arm, and slipped into a maintenance passage before the remaining warriors could coordinate their response. The explosives he deposited in a waste reclamation unit, letting the complex's systems break them down into harmless components. The evidence of the assassination attempt he kept. Dawn found him in Lord Varen's office, bleeding through a bandage he'd fashioned from his undershirt, holding a datapad that contained everything he'd documented. The Azure security chief was a narrow-faced creature whose robes bore the silver trim of minor nobility and whose expression suggested he'd just discovered something unpleasant on his shoe. "You expect me to believe," Varen's voice dripped with contempt, "that a human janitor single-handedly uncovered and foiled a plot against Her Imperial Majesty? I'm not a janitor. I'm a security guard." Marcus kept his voice level the way he had when reporting to officers who hadn't earned their rank. "And I'm not asking you to believe anything. I'm presenting evidence." Varen's eyes flicked to the datapad, then back to Marcus. Something shifted behind that alien gaze, something that looked almost like calculation. "Where did you obtain these devices?" "From 3 of your Imperial Guard, currently unconscious in Maintenance Corridor 7 Alpha." "Ah." The single syllable carried a weight of implication that made Marcus's instincts scream. "That is unfortunate. Those warriors serve Prince Kael directly. He will not be pleased to learn of their indiscretion." The way Varen said the prince's name told Marcus everything he needed to know. He'd walked into something far larger than a simple assassination plot. He'd stumbled into the middle of a succession struggle, and the man standing before him was part of it. "I want to speak with the Empress directly." Varen's laugh was like wind chimes in a hurricane. "You a human, an old man who should be grateful we allow him to walk our halls." The security chief leaned forward and his voice dropped to something cold and sharp. "Listen carefully, creature. You will forget what you saw tonight. You will return to your duties, and you will never speak of this again. Fail to comply, and I will ensure your remaining years are brief and unpleasant." Marcus had faced death before. He'd made peace with it in the sands of Kuwait, again in the streets of Fallujah, and finally in the quiet aftermath of Helen's passing. Fear was an old companion, comfortable in its familiarity. It didn't control him anymore. "You can try." Varen's face contorted into something ugly. Guards. 2 warriors materialized from alcoves. Marcus hadn't noticed their weapons already drawn. He was old, tired, wounded, and hopelessly outmatched. None of that changed what he knew needed to happen. This man attempted to assassinate Her Majesty, Varen announced, his voice carrying that particular resonance of official proclamation. He planted explosive devices near the royal chambers. Fortunately, my loyal warriors discovered his treachery before he could succeed. The words hit Marcus like a physical blow. It was perfect, really. Blame the human, protect the conspiracy to eliminate the only witness who could implicate the real plotters. That's a lie. Your word against mine. Varen's smile was thin and cruel. And in this complex, my word is law. The warriors seized Marcus's arms, wrenching his wounded shoulder in a way that sent fire cascading down his spine. Through the haze of pain, he saw Varen pick up the data pad he'd brought as evidence, watch the security chief's fingers dance across its surface. Deleted. Such a shame about your fabricated evidence. Varen stepped closer, close enough that Marcus could smell the strange alien scent of him, like ozone and distant flowers. Did you really think you could challenge us human? You are insects to us. Curiosities. Pets at best. Marcus said nothing. There was nothing to say. He tried to do the right thing, and the universe had responded the way it always did, by stacking the deck against him. Story of his life, really. Story of every life if you waited long enough. The warriors dragged him from the room, and the last thing Marcus saw was Varen reaching for a communication device, already spinning the lie that would seal his fate. They threw him in a holding cell deep in the complex's bowels, a featureless cube of energy fields that hummed at frequencies designed to discourage escape. His arm had stopped bleeding, which was good, but had started throbbing with the deep ache of potential infection, which was considerably less good. The Azure weren't known for providing medical care to accused assassins. Marcus sat in the corner of the cell and tried to organize his thoughts. Prince Kael wanted the Empress dead. Lord Varen was part of the conspiracy, probably the prince's eyes and ears within the complex. The three warriors Marcus had incapacitated were likely being disposed of. Even now, their failure a liability the plotters couldn't afford. And he, Marcus Cole, former gunnery sergeant of the United States Marine Corps, had been framed for the whole damn thing. Helen would have laughed at the absurdity of it. She'd always said his hero complex would get him killed someday. The hours crawled past in the blue glow of the energy fields. Marcus dozed fitfully, his dreams full of sand and screaming and the faces of men he'd failed to save. When he woke, it was to find he was no longer alone. She stood outside his cell, like a pillar of starlight, given form, her silver hair cascading over robes that seemed to absorb the corridor's dim illumination. The Empress's eyes, ancient and cold, studied him with an intensity that made him feel like a specimen under a microscope. "They tell me you tried to kill me." Her voice was different than he'd expected. The broadcasts always showed her as imperious, distant, wrapped in the formality of her office. This voice was tired. This voice belonged to someone who had seen too much and lived too long and stopped being surprised by betrayal centuries ago. Marcus rose slowly, his joints protesting the movement, and met her gaze. "They're lying. Everyone lies." The Empress tilted her head at that bird-like angle, all azure affected. "Why should I believe you?" It was a fair question. Marcus considered it for a moment, turning the answer over in his mind, like a stone he'd carried for decades. "Because I've got nothing to gain from the truth. I'm 68 years old. My wife is dead. My son is dead. I work the night shift at a job that pays $18 an hour, and in about 6 hours, your people are probably going to execute me for a crime I didn't commit." He shrugged, feeling the pull of his wounded arm. "The lie might buy me time, might let me negotiate for my life. But I'm too old and too tired to spend whatever time I have left pretending I'm something I'm not." The Empress said nothing for a long moment. Her eyes, luminescent and unreadable, never left his face. "My husband died 200 years ago. In a war your species cannot imagine, against enemies whose names have been erased from history. I have ruled alone since then, surrounded by courtiers who want my throne, generals who want my power, nobles who see me as an obstacle to their ambitions." Her voice remained level, but something stirred beneath the surface, something old and weary and achingly familiar. "I have learned to assume the worst of everyone. It is how I have survived. Can't argue with that strategy." And yet, she stepped closer to the energy barrier, close enough that Marcus could see the fine lines around her eyes, the subtle weight of centuries pressing down on her shoulders. "My sensors detected 3 of Prince Kael's personal guard unconscious in a maintenance quarter. Their memories have been chemically suppressed, an amateur effort likely performed in haste. The explosive devices you allegedly planted were never found, though trace elements of their unique energy signature were detected in a waste reclamation unit on the far side of the complex. Marcus kept his expression neutral, but a hope flickered in his chest despite his best efforts to suppress it. Furthermore, the Empress continued, Lord Varen's communication logs show a burst transmission to Prince Kyle's ship moments after you were arrested. The message was encrypted, but its timing is suggestive. Her lips curved in something that wasn't quite a smile. You are either the most incompetent assassin in human history, or you are telling the truth. Given what I observed of your movement through my security recordings, incompetence seems unlikely. You saw the recordings. I am Empress. I see everything that happens in spaces claimed by my authority. Her eyes sharpened. Including the way you move through those corridors. 30 years since you served in combat, yet your skills remain intact. Remarkable for a species with such brief lifespans. Marcus shrugged again. Training sticks. Indeed. The Empress made a gesture and the energy barrier dissolved. Walk with me, Marcus Cole. We have much to discuss, and I suspect very little time before my nephew makes his next move. The corridors of the complex rearranged themselves as they walked, opening paths that Marcus had never seen in 2 years of patrol. The Empress moved with the fluid grace of someone accustomed to having reality bend around her will while he did his best to keep up despite his injured arm and aching knee. My nephew believes himself subtle, she said as they walked. He has spent decades cultivating allies among the military factions who believe our alliance with Earth is a mistake. They see your species as weak, primitive, unworthy of the technology and knowledge we have shared. They advocate for conquest rather than cooperation. And you? I am old Marcus Cole, old enough to have seen the consequences of conquest. We tried it once millennia ago against a species we deemed inferior. They proved more resilient than we expected. The war lasted 3 centuries and cost us half our population. Her voice carried the weight of that history, the accumulated grief of generations. I will not repeat those mistakes, not for pride, not for resources, not for any reason my generals can conjure. They emerged onto a balcony overlooking the Houston skyline, the city's lights stretching toward the horizon like a river of stars. Dawn was approaching and painting the eastern sky in shades of orange and pink that reminded Marcus of the desert of mornings he'd watched over the barrels of a rifle, wondering if he'd see another sunset. Lord Varen is my nephew's creature. He has been for decades, though I lacked proof until now. The Empress turned to face him, her expression unreadable. By ancient law, a subject accused of crimes against the imperial person may demand trial by combat. It is an old tradition rarely invoked but still binding. Do you understand what I am telling you? Marcus felt the weight of her words settle across his shoulders. You want me to invoke the trial. I want you to have the chance to prove your innocence in a manner my nephew cannot dismiss or manipulate. The trial would be broadcast to the entire Imperium. Any evidence of conspiracy would become impossible to suppress. Her eyes met his, and for just a moment the centuries fell away, leaving only a woman who had loved and lost and learned to live with the hollow space left behind. You would face a champion of my nephew's choosing, likely my nephew himself. He would seek to kill you publicly to demonstrate human weakness and justify his faction's agenda. And if I refuse, then Varen will execute you quietly, your evidence will be buried, and my nephew will try again until he succeeds. The Empress's voice hardened. I am not asking you to fight for me, Marcus Cole. I am offering you the opportunity to fight for yourself. What you choose is your own affair. Marcus looked out at the city, at the world he'd spent 68 years living in. He thought about Helen, about Ryan, about the men he'd carried out of the desert and the ones he'd left behind. He thought about all the times he'd wondered what the point of surviving was when everyone he loved was already gone. Your nephew, his voice came out rougher than he intended. He's strong, the finest warrior of his generation, undefeated in personal combat for over a century. Fast, faster than any human could hope to match. Better equipped, better trained, better in every way that matters. Yes. Marcus nodded slowly. He'd faced impossible odds before. He'd walked into situations where every logical calculation said he should die, and he'd walked out again bloodied, but breathing. The universe owed him nothing, but he'd taken plenty anyway. I invoked trial by combat. The Empress's expression didn't change, but something shifted in her eyes, something that might have been respect or curiosity or simply the acknowledgement of one survivor to another. Then we should prepare. My nephew will not waste time once he learns of your challenge. The next 12 hours passed in a blur of preparation and politics. The Empress assigned him a private chamber far grander than anything Marcus had experienced since his wedding night, and had Azure physicians treat his arm with technology that left the wound feeling like nothing more than a fading bruise. She also provided him with information files on Prince Kyle's fighting style, his known weaknesses, the weapons he preferred. Marcus studied all of it, then set it aside. Kale was 200 years old, trained since childhood in the martial traditions of a species that had perfected warfare before humanity learned to chip flint. He moved faster, hit harder, and possessed reflexes that made human athletes look like they were wading through molasses. Any conventional approach would end with Marcus bleeding out on the floor of the dueling chamber. But Marcus hadn't survived this long by fighting conventionally. He spent the afternoon in a training room, not practicing strikes or blocks, but walking, learning the space, mapping the angles of light and shadow, the resonance of his footsteps on different surfaces, the way sounds echoed off the crystalline walls. He'd done the same thing in Kuwait, in Fallujah, in every place where the terrain might mean the difference between living and dying. The environment was a weapon. He just needed to learn how to use it. By evening, word of the trial had spread through the complex and beyond. Azure nobles filled the galleries overlooking the central chamber, their luminescent eyes fixed on the spectacle unfolding below. Human diplomats clustered in their own section, their faces a mixture of curiosity and concern. News drones from a dozen networks hovered at approved distances, broadcasting the event to billions of viewers across two species. Prince Kale entered first to a surge of murmurs and subtle gestures of approval from the military faction. He wore armor of worked silver that accentuated his warrior's build, and his blade a curved weapon that glowed with the same blue light as his eyes hung at his hip with the casual confidence of someone who had never known defeat. Marcus entered second wearing the same uniform he'd been arrested in, now cleaned and patched by the Empress's servants. His kabar hung at his belt, looking as primitive and out of place as he felt. The crowd's murmurs shifted to something between amusement and contempt. Let them laugh. He'd spent a lifetime being underestimated. The Empress rose from her throne at the chamber's apex, her voice carrying across the vast space with perfect clarity. By ancient law and sacred tradition, we gather to witness trial by combat. The accused Marcus Cole of Earth stands charged with conspiracy against the imperial person. He has invoked his right to defend his innocence through strength of arms. Prince Kyle has accepted the role of imperial champion. She paused, and Marcus could have sworn her eyes found his across the expanse of the chamber. The rules are thus: the combat shall continue until one participant yields, is rendered incapable of continuing, or is slain. No weapons beyond those carried into the chamber may be employed. No outside interference shall be tolerated. Her voice hardened. Let the truth be known through trial of will and strength. Begin. Kale moved before the last word finished echoing. Marcus had watched the recordings. He knew how fast the prince could be. But knowing and experiencing were different things, and the blur of silver and blue light that streaked toward him felt less like an attack and more like a natural disaster. He threw himself sideways, not trying to block, not trying to counter, just surviving the first second of the engagement. The blade passed close enough to slice the air near his ear, and he felt the heat of it, the barely contained energy that could cut through steel like paper. The prince recovered instantly, pivoting into a backhand strike that would have taken Marcus's head off if he'd still been where he'd been standing a heartbeat before. But he was already moving, rolling across the floor in a way that sacrificed dignity for distance, coming up 3 meters away with his knife in his hand. Kale smiled. You're faster than I expected, human. It won't save you. Marcus said nothing. Talking was for people who could afford the distraction. The prince attacked again in a flurry of strikes that tested Marcus's reflexes to their absolute limit. He blocked one, barely the impact, numbing his arm to the shoulder. He dodged another, felt it carve a line of fire across his ribs. The third caught his knife at an angle that sent sparks cascading across the floor, and he used the force of the blow to spin away, buying another precious second of life. This was the reality of the situation. He couldn't win this fight. Not through strength, not through speed, not through any conventional measure of combat effectiveness. KL was simply too good, too fast, too thoroughly superior in every category that mattered. But Marcus hadn't come here to win through strength. He retreated toward one of the chamber's crystal pillars, letting KL drive him back, letting the prince's confidence build with each step. The crowd murmured at the obvious mismatch, at the elderly human's desperate scramble for survival. KL pressed his advantage, striking at angles Marcus could barely perceive, forcing him to react on instinct alone. But instinct had kept Marcus alive through 3 wars and 40 years of service. It wouldn't fail him now. The prince lunged, overextending by a fraction of a degree, and Marcus made his move. Instead of retreating, he stepped forward, into the strike, not away from it. The blade grazed his forearm instead of piercing his chest, and suddenly he was inside Kael's guard, too close for the sword to be effective. His kabar found the gap in the prince's armor at the hip, sliding through the joint between plates, with the precision of 10,000 hours of practice. It wasn't a killing blow, wasn't even a crippling one, but it was first blood. Kael snarled and shoved him away, but the damage was done. The prince was bleeding, and the entire chamber had seen it. "You!" Kael's voice shook with disbelief. "You dare!" Marcus circled slowly, keeping his weight balanced, his breathing controlled. Blood ran down his forearm and across his ribs, but he'd had worse. He'd survived worse. The prince attacked with renewed fury, abandoning technique for raw aggression. Marcus weathered the storm as best he could, taking cuts he couldn't avoid, trading flesh for time. He was buying minutes with his blood, and sooner or later the account would come due. But he only needed to last long enough. 60 seconds, that was what the Empress had told him. Survive for 60 seconds, and she would be obligated by tradition to hear his testimony. No one in living memory had lasted that long against Kael. 50 seconds now. 40. Kael's blade carved a gash across Marcus's thigh, and he staggered, going to one knee. The prince loomed over him, victory gleaming in his luminescent eyes. Pathetic. This is the species you would ally with, Ant. This weakness. Marcus looked up at him, at this warrior prince who had never known defeat, who had never tasted the particular desperation of fighting when you had nothing left to lose. "You know what I learned in the desert?" His voice came out steady despite everything. "The strongest fighters aren't always the ones who win. Sometimes it's the ones who refuse to stay down." 30 seconds, 20. He drove the kabar up toward Kael's knee, a desperate strike that the prince deflected easily. But deflecting meant stepping back, meant creating space, meant giving Marcus time to rise to his feet again. 10 seconds. Kael roared in frustration and launched a final devastating assault. Marcus took a blow to the shoulder that sent him spinning, another across his back that opened flesh to bone. He fell forward, caught himself on his hands, forced his protesting body to move to keep moving. The gong sounded deep and resonant, marking the 60-second threshold. Marcus collapsed against a pillar, blood pooling beneath him, and managed to smile. "Guess I get to talk now." The chamber erupted into chaos. Nobles shouted. Warriors reached for weapons. Somewhere in the gallery, human diplomats were on their feet, their voices adding to the cacophony. Through it all, Marcus stayed where he was, conserving what little strength remained, watching as the Empress rose from her throne. Silence. The single word cut through the noise like a blade through silk. Every voice stopped. Every movement ceased. The Empress descended from her dais, her robes flowing behind her like a river of midnight, and approached the place where Marcus lay bleeding. By tradition and law, the accused has survived the threshold. He has earned the right to speak, and we are bound to hear. Her eyes swept across the assembly, lingering on Kael's furious face. "Let the testimony begin." Marcus pushed himself upright, using the pillar for support. Every movement sent fresh waves of pain through his battered body, but pain was just information. Pain could be managed. 3 nights ago, I observed a group of warriors planting explosive devices near the Empress's quarters. I neutralized them and brought evidence to Lord Varen, who destroyed it and accused me of the very crime I'd prevented it. He paused, letting the words sink in. The warriors I stopped were wearing Prince Kael's insignia. Lord Varen contacted the prince's ship immediately after my arrest, and the explosive devices I found were Azure military grade, accessible only to senior commanders or members of the royal family. The silence that followed was absolute. Then a new voice cut through the stillness, young and clear, and trembling with barely suppressed fear. He speaks the truth. Every eye in the chamber turned toward the speaker. A young azure female had stepped forward from the crowd, her robes marking her as minor nobility, her features bearing an unmistakable resemblance to the Empress herself. She was small by azure standards, perhaps 80 years old, barely an adult by their reckoning. Her hands were shaking, but her voice held steady. Marcus recognized her from the reception, a slight figure who had watched everything from the edges of the crowd. Princess Lyra, the Empress's granddaughter. I was in the garden alcove 3 nights ago. Lyra continued, her words gaining strength as she spoke. I saw Prince Kael's servants preparing the poison. I heard them discuss timing method and the need to eliminate witnesses. She turned to face Kael directly, and something fierce burned in her young eyes. I should have spoken sooner. I was afraid. But fear is not a reason to let injustice stand. The reaction was immediate and explosive. Kael lunged toward Lyra, his blade rising, but the Empress was faster. Energy crackled from her outstretched hand, a barrier of pure light that stopped the prince in his tracks. You would attack my heir in my presence. Valeria's voice had gone colder than Marcus had ever heard it. You would compound assassination with kinslaying. She lies. Kael's composure had shattered completely. The girl lies to protect her foreign pet. She has always been weak, always been. Enough, the Empress's voice echoed through the chamber like thunder. Lord Varen, step forward. The security chief emerged from the crowd, his face a mask of careful neutrality. But Marcus could see the calculation behind his eyes, the desperate search for an escape route that didn't exist. Your communications have been reviewed, Valeria continued. Your accounts traced. Your co-conspirators identified. She raised one hand, and guards in the Empress's own colors materialized from alcoves throughout the chamber. You are charged with treason against the Imperial throne. How do you plead? Varen's mask cracked. His hand moved toward a concealed weapon. He never completed the motion. The guards were on him in an instant, forcing him to the ground, stripping away his robes and the devices hidden within them. When they dragged him upright, his face was a ruin of fury and despair. This changes nothing, he spat. The prince still has allies. The military faction will never accept. The military faction will accept what I tell them to accept, or they will face the consequences of rebellion. The Empress turned back to Kael, who stood frozen within her barrier of light. As for my nephew, he will face trial before the full Imperial Assembly. Until then, he will be confined to quarters under constant guard. Kael's eyes found Marcus across the chamber, and the hatred in them was absolute. This isn't overhuman. Whatever happens, I will see you dead. Marcus met his gaze without flinching. People keep telling me that, and yet here I am. The guards led Kael away, and the chamber slowly began to empty. Nobles whispered among themselves, their certainties shaken by what they'd witnessed. Human diplomats clustered together, trying to process implications they couldn't fully grasp. Through it all, Marcus remained where he was, bleeding against the pillar, watching as Lyra approached with hesitant steps. You're injured. Her voice was soft, uncertain, so different from the fierce declaration she'd made moments before. I've been injured before. Because of me, because I didn't speak when I should have. She stopped a few feet away, her eyes glistening with something that might have been tears. If I had been braver, you spoke when it mattered. Marcus pushed himself away from the pillar, swaying slightly, refusing to fall. That took more courage than anything I did. Fighting is easy when you've got nothing to lose. Standing up when you've got everything to lose, that's the hard part. Lyra absorbed his words, something shifting in her young features. Before she could respond, the Empress herself arrived, flanked by physicians carrying equipment Marcus couldn't identify. The princess is correct. You require medical attention. Valeria's voice carried its usual authority, but there was something else beneath it, something that might have been gratitude. My physicians will see to your wounds. Tomorrow we will discuss what comes next. What comes next? The Empress's lips curved in the faintest suggestion of a smile. Tonight you rest. Tomorrow we plan. My nephew's faction has suffered a blow, but the conspiracy runs deeper than one prince and one security chief. There is much work to be done. She turned to leave, then paused, looking back over her shoulder. You have done a remarkable thing today, Marcus Cole. You have reminded my people that strength takes many forms and that sometimes the most powerful warriors are those who simply refuse to surrender. Her eyes held his for a long moment. Rest well. You have earned it. The physicians descended on him, their devices humming with alien technology, and Marcus let himself be carried away on a tide of exhaustion and relief. Somewhere in the back of his mind, a voice that sounded remarkably like Helen's whispered that this was only the beginning. He was too tired to argue. The medical bay's blue light had become familiar over the past 3 days. Marcus drifted between consciousness and healing, his body mending faster than any human medicine could have managed, his mind processing everything that had happened. He dreamed of Helen, of Ryan, of sand-colored memories that shifted and changed with each passing hour. Sometimes the dreams were peaceful, sometimes they were not. But when he woke on the fourth morning, it was to find Lyra sitting beside his bed, her attention fixed on a tablet displaying tactical diagrams. She looked up when he stirred. "You're awake." The physician said the regeneration process was nearly complete. "Feels like it." Marcus sat up, testing his movements. The wounds Kale had inflicted were gone, replaced by new skin that still felt slightly strange, slightly too smooth. "How long have you been here?" "A few hours. I've been studying." She set the tablet aside. "Human military history, your wars, your tactics, your strategies. I thought understanding how your species fought might help me understand how you survived against my cousin." "And what did you learn?" "That humans are remarkably persistent." She met his eyes, something flickering in her gaze that hadn't been there before the trial. "Your species has faced extinction-level threats multiple times. You've fought wars that consumed entire generations. And through it all, you've refused to give up. Stubbornness isn't always a virtue. Maybe not, but it kept you alive when every calculation said you should have died." Lyra leaned forward, her voice dropping. "Teach me." The request caught him off guard. "Teach you what?" "How to be stubborn, how to stand up when I'm afraid, how to fight for something even when everyone around me says it's impossible." Her hands clenched in her lap. "I spent my whole life watching from the sidelines. When I finally found the courage to speak, it was almost too late. I don't want to be that person anymore. I want to be someone who acts, not someone who hesitates." Marcus studied her, this young princess who had risked everything to tell the truth. She reminded him of Ryan at that age, all fierce determination and untested courage. The resemblance made something twist in his chest. "Where I come from, we have a saying. Courage isn't the absence of fear. It's being scared to death and saddling up anyway." He swung his legs over the edge of the bed. "You already have the courage, Lyra. What you need is training." Her eyes widened. "You mean?" "I mean that if you want to learn, I'll teach you, but it won't be easy, and it won't be quick. Real training takes years, not days." Before she could respond, the medical bay's doors slid open to admit the Empress herself. Valeria moved with purpose, her face bearing an expression Marcus had learned to recognize. Something had gone wrong. "Leave us, Lyra." The princess hesitated, glancing at Marcus, then rose and departed. When the doors closed behind her, Valeria's composure cracked slightly. "We have a problem." Kale, his loyalists. Last night, a faction of his most devoted supporters staged a coordinated assault on the detention facility. They freed him, killed 17 guards, and escaped to his personal cruiser before we could respond. The Empress's voice tightened. "The cruiser is currently in orbit just outside our weapons range, and Kyle has transmitted a message to every communication channel in the system." She made a gesture, and a holographic display materialized in the air between them. Kael's face filled the projection, his features twisted with rage and wounded pride. "Citizens of the Imperium, I address you from exile, driven from my rightful place by the machinations of a human savage and a senile empress who has forgotten what it means to rule." His voice dripped with venom. "I hereby renounce my allegiance to the throne. Those who share my vision of a stronger Imperium, freed from the weakness of human alliance, are welcome to join me." The message continued, but Marcus had already grasped the essential point. Civil war. Kael was calling for civil war. "How many will follow him?" he asked when the projection faded. "Unknown. Perhaps a tenth of the military. Perhaps more." Valeria's age showed in her eyes the weight of centuries pressing down. But even a tenth would be enough to cause significant damage. And Kael possesses something we do not: a willingness to harm civilians. He's going to attack Earth. He's going to threaten to attack Earth. His cruiser's weapons are currently trained on Houston. 4 million people held hostage against my abdication. The Empress's hands clenched at her sides. He believes I will sacrifice anything to protect innocent lives. He believes that makes me weak. Marcus rose from the bed, testing his newly healed body. Everything felt strong, stable, better than it had in years. What are your options? Limited. An assault on his cruiser would result in catastrophic casualties on both sides. Negotiation would only legitimize his rebellion. And surrender would doom the alliance with Earth and invite conquest. She met his gaze. There is, however, one possibility. Tell me. My nephew's cruiser has a vulnerability. A maintenance access point designed for external repairs leading to service corridors that eventually connect to the primary weapons control center. The approach is difficult, the opposition formidable, and the probability of success extremely low. Her voice remained steady, but something shifted in her eyes. It would require someone skilled enough to infiltrate, experienced enough to improvise, and expendable enough that their loss wouldn't trigger diplomatic consequences. Marcus allowed himself a thin smile. You're asking me to single-handedly assault an alien warship. I am offering an opportunity to the only individual who has demonstrated the capability to accomplish the impossible. She stepped closer, and for a moment the centuries fell away, leaving only a woman asking another survivor for help. What you choose is your own affair. He thought about Houston, about 4 million people who had no idea their lives hung in the balance. He thought about Lyra, who had just found her courage and didn't deserve to see her world burn. He thought about Helen and Ryan and all the people he'd failed to save, all the times he'd chosen survival over sacrifice. I'll need schematics, entry points, guard rotations. He met the Empress's gaze, and someone who knows the ship's layout. I anticipated your response. The ghost of a smile crossed her features. Preparations have already begun. The briefing took 3 hours and covered everything from the cruiser's structural weak points to the cultural psychology of Kael's remaining loyalists. Marcus absorbed it all at his old training, rising to the surface like muscle memory, transforming information into tactical planning. The insertion point was a maintenance hatch on the cruiser's underbelly designed for external repairs during spaceflight. It led to a series of service corridors that wound through the ship's infrastructure, eventually connecting to the primary weapons control center. The distance was approximately 300 meters. The journey would take him past 4 guard stations and through 2 security checkpoints. He'd faced worse odds in Kuwait. Lyra appeared halfway through the briefing, slipping into the room with determination written across her features. The Empress acknowledged her with a glance, but didn't order her away. The guards at the 3rd station rotate every 12 minutes. Lyra's voice was steady as she highlighted a section of the schematics. But there's a 4-minute overlap during shift change when both teams are present. If you time your approach wrong, you'll face twice the opposition. Good catch. Marcus studied the diagram. What about the security checkpoints? Biometric scanners. They'll detect human physiology immediately. Lyra pulled up another display. But I found something in the ship's technical specifications. The scanners have a maintenance mode that bypasses the biometric functions. If someone were to trigger that mode from an external terminal, you'd need access to the ship's secondary systems. The Empress's tone carried warning. That terminal is located in the cruiser's communications center, heavily guarded deep in hostile territory. I know. Lyra met her grandmother's eyes without flinching. I can do it. Absolutely not. You are my heir. The risk is exactly why it needs to happen. Lyra straightened her voice, gaining strength. You can't protect me from every danger. You can only prepare me to face them. Someone told me recently that fear isn't a reason to let injustice stand. The same principle applies here. The Empress's expression flickered between fury and something that looked almost like pride. You would quote human philosophy at me. I would quote wisdom regardless of its source. Lyra held her ground. Grandmother, I've spent my whole life watching others act while I stood safely aside. If Marcus is willing to risk his life for our people, how can I do less? Marcus watched the exchange, seeing echoes of arguments he'd had with Ryan before his son's final deployment. The fierce determination, the unwillingness to be protected, the desperate need to prove worth through action. "She's right," he said quietly. "I'll need someone in to handle the security systems. Can't do it myself and complete the primary objective." Valeria's gaze snapped to him, sharp and dangerous. "You would take my granddaughter into a combat zone. I would give her the chance to make a difference. Same chance you're giving me." The silence stretched. Then slowly the Empress inclined her head. "Brief her on the secondary approach. Teach her what she needs to know." She turned to Lyra and her voice softened. "If you are harmed, I will burn worlds." "I know, grandmother." Lyra reached out, touching Valeria's hand. "But I would rather die fighting for our family than live knowing I was too afraid to trust you." The cruiser hung in the Houston sky like a blade waiting to fall, its hull gleaming with azure luminescence. Shuttles surrounded it in a holding pattern, weapons trained but not firing, while below the city continued its morning routines in blissful ignorance. Marcus and Lyra approached in a maintenance pod, its signature masked to appear as routine support craft. The plan was simple in concept: infiltrate the ship, disable the weapons, survive long enough for the Empress's forces to board. 30 seconds to insertion point. Lyra's voice came through the communication device fitted behind Marcus's ear, steady despite the tremor in her hands. "Remember the timing. I'll draw their attention at the third guard station. That's your window to reach the communication center." "Marcus," her voice dropped, losing its professional edge. "In case this doesn't work, I wanted to thank you for believing in me when no one else did. Save it for after. We're going to survive this, and then you're going to have a lot more to thank me for, because Raz, the training I have planned is going to make this mission look easy." A surprised laugh escaped her. "You're very strange for a human." "So I've been told." The pod docked with a soft clunk and the hatch cycled open. Marcus moved through, first sweeping the space with practiced efficiency, finding it empty, as expected. "Good luck, Princess." "And you, Marcus Cole." She slipped away into the ship's labyrinth, following a route they'd memorized together. Marcus watched her go, then turned toward his own path. There would be time for sentiment later, if there was a later. The service corridors wound through the cruiser like arteries. Marcus moved through them like he'd moved through hostile territory his entire life, using shadow and sound to track guard positions. The first station fell quickly. Two warriors, overconfident in their security, never saw the blade that ended them. Marcus dragged the bodies into a maintenance closet and kept moving. The second station proved trickier. Three warriors with overlapping sight lines positioned to support each other. Marcus assessed the situation, calculated angles, and threw one of the tactical devices Lyra had provided. The explosion was small, but loud. The warriors spun toward the source, and Marcus came at them from behind like death given form. In 10 seconds, it was over. "Marcus!" Lyra's voice crackled in his ear. "I've reached the communication center. There are more guards than expected. I'm going to need time to work around them." "How much time?" "Unknown. The terminal is behind a secondary barrier. I'm working on bypassing it, but the encryption is complex." Marcus checked his chronometer. The window was closing. "Keep working. I'll buy you what time I can." He approached the third guard station, the one with the overlapping shifts, and made a decision. Sometimes the best approach wasn't stealth at all. He stepped into the quarter, weapon raised, and opened fire. The firefight was brutal and brief. Marcus killed 4 warriors before they understood what was happening, took a plasma burn across his shoulder from the 5th, and engaged the final 2 in close combat. His knife found vital points with practiced precision. When it was over, he stood among the bodies, breathing hard, blood running from the fresh wound. His shoulder screamed, but the pain was manageable. Pain was always manageable. Lyra, status. Almost through the encryption, 20 seconds. He moved toward the 4th guard station, but the corridor ahead was filling with warriors who was responding to the commotion. Too many to fight. Too many to evade. "Marcus, I'm in. Security checkpoints are disabled. You have a clear path to weapons control." "I've got company. A lot of company. Can you get through?" He looked at the approaching force, counted at least 15 warriors, and felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Certainty. "Get out, Lyra. Get to the extraction point." Marcus, that's an order, princess. I'll handle this. He switched off the communicator before she could argue, raised his weapon, and charged directly into the enemy formation. The next 3 minutes were a blur of violence and desperation. Marcus fought like he'd never fought before, using every trick he'd learned in 40 years of service, every dirty tactic that kept soldiers alive when they should have died. He took wounds he couldn't count, killed enemies he couldn't remember, pushed through pain that should have stopped him cold. When he finally reached the weapons control center, he was barely standing. Blood soaked his uniform. His left arm hung useless at his side. His vision blurred at the edges. But he reached it. The door slid open and Prince Kael stood waiting. I knew you'd come. The prince looked worse than he had during the trial. His wounds had been treated but not fully healed, leaving him moving stiffly. But he still carried his blade and his eyes still burned with absolute hatred. Your grandmother sent me. Marcus raised his weapon, knowing it was useless at this range. This doesn't have to end badly. It ended badly the moment you refused to die. Kael's blade ignited. You've taken everything from me, my reputation, my position, my future, and you're just a human, a fragile, short-lived creature who should have been nothing more than an amusement. I've been called worse. Kael attacked. The prince was wounded but still faster than any human, still stronger than Marcus could match. Their first exchange left Marcus bleeding from a new wound across his chest. This is how it should have ended in the trial. Kael pressed his advantage. With you dying at my feet, Marcus parried, deflected, survived each exchange by shrinking margins. His body was failing, his reserves were empty. You want to know why you lost the trial? He gasped between desperate blocks. It wasn't because I was stronger or faster. Then why? Kael's blade carved another line across Marcus's arm. Because I was willing to die and you weren't. I fought because losing wasn't an option. That's the difference between us. Kael's next strike came for his heart. Instead of blocking, Marcus stepped into it. Let the blade pierce his shoulder, let the pain explode through him, and drove his knife toward Kael's throat. They froze, locked in mutual destruction. Kael's blade buried in Marcus's shoulder. Marcus's knife pressed against the prince's jugular. Kill me, Kael hissed. Finish it. No, Marcus's vision was fading. You're going to surrender. You're going to live with knowing a human beat you twice. And you're going to spend the rest of your life remembering this moment. I'll never stop trying to kill you. I know, but that's tomorrow's problem. The blade clattered to the floor. Marcus released the prince, staggered toward the weapons control console, and disabled the targeting systems with hands that could barely move. Behind him he heard shouts, the sound of boarding parties finally breaching the cruiser. Marcus! Lyra's voice coming from somewhere close. He turned toward it, saw her face at the end of the corridor, pale with fear. You were supposed to evacuate, he mumbled. I don't take orders from humans. She reached him just as his legs gave out, catching him before he hit the floor. The last thing he saw was her face, young and terrified, and fierce, hovering above him like a guardian angel with alien features. Don't you dare die, she whispered. I haven't finished thanking you yet. Marcus wanted to laugh, but the darkness was already closing in. He let it take him, trusting that whatever came next, he'd done enough. He'd kept his promise. The darkness held him gently like Helen's arms in the quiet hours before dawn. Marcus drifted through memories that felt more real than any waking moment. He was 23 again, standing at the altar of a small church in Virginia, watching Helen walk toward him in a dress her mother had worn 30 years before. Her smile outshone the stained glass windows, and when she took his hand, he knew with absolute certainty that he would spend the rest of his life trying to deserve her. He was 47, teaching Ryan to drive in the empty parking lot of the abandoned Sears. His son's hands gripped the steering wheel, two tight knuckles white with concentration. Ryan looked at him with Helen's eyes and asked if trusting a machine was the same as trusting people. Marcus hadn't known how to answer then. He still didn't. He was 56, standing in a cemetery outside Arlington, watching them lower a flag-draped coffin into the Virginia clay. The honor guard's rifles cracked 3 times, and each shot felt like a bullet passing through his own chest. Helen stood beside him, both of them understanding that something essential had broken and would never be whole again. He was 63, sitting in a hospital room holding Helen's hand as she took her last breath. She'd made him promise to keep living, to find something worth fighting for, To remember that surviving wasn't the same as giving up. He'd promised because he couldn't deny her anything, even something he wasn't sure he could deliver. The memories shifted, blurred, reformed. He was standing in a field of stars, the universe spreading around him in every direction. Ryan stood before him, young and whole, wearing the dress blues he'd been buried in. Helen was there too, her hair silver, like the Empress's, her smile unchanged by death. "You did good, Dad," Ryan's voice carried across the impossible distance. "You kept fighting." "I'm tired." The words emerged from somewhere deep. "I'm so tired." "I know." Helen moved closer. "But you're not done yet. There's still someone who needs you." Marcus thought of Lyra, young and frightened and brave beyond her years. Thought of Valeria, ancient and alone, and reaching out for connection after 2 centuries of isolation. "Will I see you again someday?" Helen's smile was the same as on their wedding day. "But not yet. Not for a long time yet." The stars began to fade. Ryan raised his hand in salute. Helen pressed her lips to Marcus's forehead. Then the darkness released him. He opened his eyes to blue light in the face of an empress who had been crying. "You're awake." Valeria's voice was rough, stripped of its imperial cadence. She sat beside his bed, her silver hair disheveled, her robes wrinkled. The medical bay hummed around them. "How long?" "8 days. We nearly lost you 4 times." She reached for water, held it to his lips. "The blade punctured your lung, nicked an artery, caused internal bleeding that should have been fatal. If Lyra hadn't applied emergency treatment when she did, you would have died in that corridor." "Lyra," memory flooded back. "Is she safe, unharmed? She's been here every day, refusing to leave until I ordered her to rest." Something softened in Valeria's eyes. "She saved your life, Marcus. Applied human first aid techniques she'd studied from your military manuals. Kept you breathing until the medical team arrived." Relief washed through him. He'd kept his promise. And Kyle, in custody, awaiting trial before the full Imperial Assembly. His faction has been dismantled. His co-conspirators, including Lord Varen, have been arrested. The threat they represented is ended. She paused. His cruiser's weapons were disabled moments before they would have fired on Houston. 4 million lives saved because an old human refused to surrender. "Just doing my job." "Your job was night security at $18 an hour. The ghost of a smile crossed her ancient features. "I believe you've exceeded your job description." Silence settled between them, comfortable in a way that spoke of shared experience. They had both lost people they loved. They had both learned to carry the weight of survival. "I have a proposal," Valeria said at last. "The conspiracy is broken, but the attitudes that created it remain. My nephew believed humanity was weak because he never saw a human demonstrate otherwise. His faction grew powerful because our people have forgotten what courage looks like when it isn't measured in centuries or superior technology." "What are you suggesting?" "You showed my granddaughter something in days that I failed to teach her in 80 years. You showed her that strength isn't about power or capability. It's about standing up when standing is hard, fighting when fighting seems futile, refusing to let fear make your decisions." Valeria rose, moving to the window where Houston's skyline glittered beneath the morning sun. "I want you to stay. Not as a political symbol, not as a trophy, as an advisor, a teacher." She turned to face him. "Lyra needs someone to show her what leadership means in practice. My commanders need to understand that humanity is not the weakness they assume, and I need someone who will tell me the truth even when it's unpleasant." Marcus thought about Helen's words about finding something worth fighting for. He thought about Ryan, about the legacy of service that had defined his family. He thought about the empty apartment in Houston, the night shifts that led nowhere, the slow erosion of purpose since Helen's death. "I'm 68 years old. I'm not going to live forever." "No one does." Valeria's smile was sad and knowing. "But the time you have could change history. You've already proven that." He considered the offer. Stay and serve, teach and advise. Find meaning in remaining years by passing on what he'd learned. "I have conditions. You would negotiate with me." "Someone told me truth is more valuable than power." I believed her. He pushed himself upright. "First, I want access to all intelligence regarding threats to Earth. If something's coming, I want to know about it." "Reasonable. Continue." Second authority to train whoever I think needs training, regardless of rank. If a general needs humility lessons, I'm going to teach them. That will make you unpopular. I've been unpopular before. Third Lyra works with me directly, not as a student in a classroom, but as a partner. She's got potential, but potential means nothing if it's never tested. She is my heir. The risk is exactly why it needs to happen. You can't protect her from every danger. You can only prepare her to face them. The Empress studied him for a long moment. Then she inclined her head. Very well, Marcus Cole. We have a bargain. The weeks that followed were a blur of activity. Marcus's new quarters were in the diplomatic wing near the Empress's chambers. They were larger than any space he'd lived in since childhood, filled with alien technology he only half understood. But he spent most of his time elsewhere. The training complex became his domain. Azure warriors who had scorned humanity as weak found themselves facing drills designed by someone who had survived 3 wars through cunning. Marcus taught them to think like insurgents, fight like cornered animals, never assume an enemy was beaten until they stopped breathing. Lyra attended every session. She was quick and clever and eager, but more importantly, willing to fail. Again, he circled her as she recovered from a throw. You're telegraphing your strikes. I'm trying to be precise. Precision is valuable. Predictability gets you killed. He positioned himself across from her. Combat isn't a dance. It's chaos with weapons. Your enemy won't follow your rules. Why should you follow theirs? She attacked again this time, feinting left, going right, dropping low when he expected high. Not enough to beat him, but progress. Better, much better. I had a good teacher. She paused. Marcus, can I ask you something? Saying, always. What was he like, your son? The question caught him off guard. He'd mentioned Ryan in passing, but never spoken about him directly. He was brave. Too brave, maybe. He saw the Marines as a calling, not a job. When he deployed to Afghanistan, he was so certain he could help. Marcus walked to the edge of the training mat. IED. His convoy was hit outside Kandahar. He survived the initial blast, but went back to pull his squad mates out of the burning vehicles. Saved 3 of them before the secondary device detonated. He sounds like you. He was better than me. He believed in things I'd stopped believing in years earlier. Marcus blinked hard. When I got the news, part of me was proud. He died exactly the way he would have wanted, but another part just wanted my son back. That's not selfish. That's love. Yeah, that's the thing about being human. We know our time is limited. We know everyone we love will eventually be gone, and we love them anyway. Is that why you stayed to honor him? Marcus considered the question. Partly, but also because I met a girl who reminded me of him, who had the same fire, the same potential, the same willingness to risk everything for something she believed in. He placed a hand on her shoulder. I couldn't save Ryan. Maybe I can help you survive long enough to become the leader your people need. Lyra's eyes glistened. I won't let you down. I know you won't. The months accumulated each day, adding another layer to what they were building. Marcus trained warriors and advised generals and argued with diplomats. He sat in council sessions where decisions affecting billions were made and reminded everyone that numbers represented people with families and dreams. He taught Lyra everything he knew about combat and strategy. More importantly, he taught her about leadership, about responsibility, about sending others into danger when you couldn't go yourself. The hardest part, he told her one evening, watching the sun set over Houston, isn't making the decision. It's living with it afterward. Knowing people died because of choices you made, even when those choices were right. How do you live with it? You don't, not really. You carry it, you let it change you, and you make sure their sacrifice meant something. The Empress joined them, sometimes setting aside the burdens of rule for discussions that ranged from tactical theory to the nature of consciousness. You're good for her, Valeria observed one night, watching Lyra practice forms in the courtyard below. Good for both of us, perhaps. I'm an old man telling war stories. You're a living reminder that strength takes many forms. Her voice carried weight. My people measure worth in centuries. We assume that anything brief cannot be significant. You've challenged that assumption simply by being who you are. And who's that? Someone who refuses to accept limits. Someone who fights even when fighting seems impossible. someone who cares about others despite knowing he'll lose them. She turned to face him. You've taught my granddaughter that courage isn't about being unafraid. It's about acting despite fear. That lesson alone would justify everything you've done. They stood in comfortable silence watching Lyra move through modified forms she'd learned from Marcus. She'll be a good ruler, he said, when her time comes, though. Yes, thanks in large part to you. Valeria paused. I have lived for 4.5 centuries. In all that time, I have learned one thing that matters. What's that? That the measure of a life is not its length, but its depth. The connections we make, the people we change, the ripples we send into the universe that continue after we're gone. She placed her hand on his arm. Your son's life was brief, but his sacrifice saved 3 people who have gone on to touch countless others. His ripples continue. Marcus felt the truth settle into his chest, filling spaces that had been empty too long. Ryan's death had seemed so senseless. But viewed from this perspective, it was part of a pattern larger than any individual life. And my ripples, they've barely begun. 6 months after the failed coup, Marcus stood on the training field and watched his students engage in their final exercise. 20 Azure warriors faced off against each other in a simulation testing everything he'd taught them. They moved with precision, but also with adaptability. They thought like humans now, at least in combat. They expected the unexpected and planned for betrayal. Lyra moved among them as an observer evaluating performance, work that had once been reserved for senior officials. They're good, she said, joining Marcus at the field's edge. Better than last year's graduates. They'll need to be. The universe doesn't get safer because we want it to. Thanks to you. Thanks to them. I just showed them what was possible. Lyra was quiet for a moment. I've been thinking about what you said, about carrying the people we've lost, about letting their sacrifice mean something. She turned to face him. My grandfather died 200 years ago. I never knew him. But everything my grandmother has told me paints a picture of someone who believed in the same things you believe in. Strength through conviction. Courage through action. He sounds like a good man. He was. And I've realized something. Lyra straightened. You're not just teaching us to fight like humans. You're teaching us to hope like humans. To believe that individuals matter, that single actions can change history, that tomorrow might be better than today. Marcus felt something loosen in his chest. That's a lot to take from war stories. It's everything. Lyra took his hand. When I become empress, when my grandmother finally allows herself to rest, I want you there, not as an advisor, as family, as the grandfather I never had. The words struck him like a physical blow, but not a painful one. It was the impact of something breaking free, walls collapsing that he hadn't realized he'd built. He thought of Ryan, of grandchildren he'd never had, of the legacy that had seemed to end in Kandahar. I'd be honored, Lyra smiled. Come on, the graduation ceremony starts in an hour. They walked together toward the diplomatic complex. Behind them, warriors completed their exercise, their shouts fading into the background of a world slowly learning to hope. The ceremony was everything an Azure formal occasion should be: elaborate, elegant, and 30 minutes longer than necessary. Warriors received commissions with solemn pride. Dignitaries made speeches. The Empress presided over everything with patient grace. But when it was over, Valeria found Marcus on his favorite balcony. You've done something remarkable, she said. Something I couldn't have achieved alone. You could have. You just needed someone to remind you how. Perhaps. She faced the horizon. I've lived so long, seen so much. It becomes difficult to believe anything truly new is possible. Change always comes from unexpected directions. That's what makes it change. She laughed, a genuine sound. You sound like my husband. He sounds like a wise man. They watched the city together, alien architecture, meeting human sprawl in a boundary that had once seemed insurmountable. Now it just looked like neighbors learning to coexist. What will you do, Valeria asked, when your time comes? Marcus considered the question. He'd been considering it more often lately. I'll die knowing I made a difference. Knowing the people I taught will carry on what I started. Knowing that a young princess learned courage isn't about being unafraid. He smiled. That's more than most people get. And your family. I'll see them again, someday. He felt the certainty of it. Until then, I've got work to do. The Empress nodded slowly. Then we should get back to it. Tomorrow's schedule includes negotiations with the Ferralis Collective. Let me guess, they've been expressing concerns again. They've been making threats they can't follow through on. Her smile turned sharp. I thought perhaps someone should call their bluff. And you want me to do the calling. You have a talent for it. She began walking toward the interior, then paused. Coming. Marcus took one last look at the city, at the world he'd spent 68 years living in. He thought about Helen and Ryan, about Lyra and Valeria, and the strange family he'd found among aliens who lived for centuries. Then he followed the Empress into the light. The days continued. The work continued. The future unfolded in ways no one could have predicted. And somewhere in the vast machinery of an empire that had existed for millennia, an old man from Texas taught young aliens what it meant to be human, to love despite loss, to fight, despite fear, to believe that every moment mattered, especially because time was finite. Ryan would have been proud. Helen would have understood. And Marcus Cole, former gunnery sergeant of the United States Marine Corps, finally found the peace he'd been searching for since his world fell apart. Not in rest, not in forgetting, but in purpose, in connection, in the endless work of building something better than what came before. The measure of a life, Valeria had told him, is not its length, but its depth. By that measure, Marcus Cole had lived a life worth remembering, and he wasn't done yet.